Corn School is brought to you by BASF and Pride Seeds.
Welcome to Corn School. I'm Bernard Tobin. Today we're going to talk about cost of production and how Ontario stacks up against the world, countries like the United States, Argentina, and Ukraine. To get some insights, I talk with John Molenhuis. He's a cost of production specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture. And John has some really great insights about, profitability, input costs, and whether it really is greener on the other side of the fence. Take a look. John, now let's talk about the Agra benchmark study that you did. And what were you hoping to learn about the cost of producing corn?
Well, the Agra benchmark network was set up in 2006, so it's been going on for about 12 years. So it's a network of countries that have partnered together on a consistent data collection and standardized data collection approach. And the main intent was for them to then be able to do international farm comparisons. And Ontario for the last 4 years have participated in the cash crop, swine and beef networks, mainly because of the reliance of those commodities in Ontario on the export markets. So we wanted to have a look at how competitive Ontario was to their global counterparts. And within the cash crop network, there's 45 different countries that Ontario can now compare themselves to on a competitiveness basis. And so we're looking to see just how Ontario compares to them, not just in terms of cost of production profitability, obviously that's important, but as well drilling down into the production systems and trying to see what are some of the differences on the production systems that contribute to the differences in the financial performance that we're seeing.
Now, hey, the first thing I saw when looking at it was size. And then how does corn production in Canada, Ontario, stack up against those countries you compared?
Well, if you look at Canada on a world productions ranking is sitting in 11th as far as a corn producing country. So, and Ontario is roughly about 2/3 of that production. So Ontario is a fairly major player in corn production in the Canadian perspective. And then we wanted to have a look at how they compared to the top corn producing countries. So we looked at the top 5 corn producing countries were US, China, Ukraine, Brazil, and Argentina. So we wanted to have a look at those, how Ontario compared to those top 5 countries.
Now, an obvious sort of thing that sort of called out to me here was moisture. You looked at it, rainfall, and the old saying that, rain makes grain. And Canada really is well positioned here.
They are, and both U.S. and Canada have, and especially Ontario as well. I mean, so we've got, and we used rainfall as a bit of a general gauge on sort of the country's climate capacity to produce corn. So we're just having a look at that side of it. And you see in the slide that Ontario and U.S. are the top producers in this group of countries that we're looking at, top producers as far as yields and well positioned on per acre yields for corn. One of the things you do need to be mindful of or keep in mind with countries like Brazil and Argentina and China is their ability to double crop. So they're not just getting corn yields, and you see the corn yields of those countries are lower than what you would see in Ontario and US, but they also have the ability to then double crop. So you're in Brazil and Argentina, it's typically soybeans that they're double cropping with. In China, it's typically a corn wheat production rotation. So they have that ability to then double crop. So the production on that per acre per year really has to consider both of those crops in that production side. So, and has a big impact when you're looking at production costs as far as especially on the fixed cost side of things, where land costs and machinery investment costs, their ability to then spread those costs over more production with the advantage of having the double crop system.
Now, input costs are always a big part of this story. How does Ontario stack up here?
So on input costs, we're about middle of the pack of this group as far as on the input cost side of things. And in the input costs, we're looking at seed, fertilizer, and pesticides. So just looking at those direct input costs. And Ontario is in the middle of the pack, and you see China and US are on the higher side, and then the other ones are a little bit on the lower side. And Ontario has, and some of the things that you want to be looking at as well in considering these is what those impacts of different countries having access to different technologies, and seed technologies is one where you look at, you may have countries that don't have access to some certain traded seeds, so you may see seed costs lower in those countries, but their pesticide costs are higher, where if they have access to traded seeds, their seed costs may be higher, but then the pesticide costs are lower. So nowadays you almost need to be looking at both the seed and pesticides as a total cost for those two to be able to do a good comparison across the two of them. But in terms of input costs, Ontario stacked up fairly well, middle of the pack in this group.
Nitrogen is always an interesting story here too, John. It speaks to the need for Ontario farmers to be as efficient as possible, but it also speaks to the ability of countries like Ukraine and China to produce their own nitrogen, having tremendous sources of that.
No, that's right. You see that Ukraine and China have some of the lowest nitrogen costs on a per unit basis than any of the other countries, and that's the big advantage of being a fairly major fertilizer producing country. So you've got access to that fertilizer on those ready access to fertilizers locally, where in US and in Ontario we don't have access to those, and you see the Ontario fertilizer price in the slides here are a little higher too, at $1.49. And in the model that we're using for the Ontario, we're using 28% UAN, so a liquid fertilizer for the Ontario farms, which tends to be a higher priced nitrogen source, but it also has the advantage of being able to, because it's a liquid fertilizer, the ability to then mix it with other fertilizers and pesticides to be able to do multiple operations in one pass. So you're reducing the machinery costs. So it's again, you may have the higher fertilizer costs, but you may be reducing some of the machinery operating costs because you do less passes in the field, with the advantage of being able to tank mix some of these. But and certainly you see on the nitrogen efficiency side, Ontario does fairly well as far as their production, the amount of production they're getting out of the kilogram of nitrogen they're doing. They're again sort of in the middle of the group as far as being able to produce production based on the amount of nitrogen they're applying.
Yeah, so overall I guess the big question is profitability, and how does Ontario measure up here? My sense is maybe a little better than the US, but certainly trailing Argentina and Ukraine based on some of the factors you pointed out.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, when you look at the total cost and total profitability side of things, I mean, you look at some of the charts, China is by far the highest cost producer that you're seeing, and so they're caught, and that wasn't true in almost every category. In every one of the direct input costs and land costs and labor costs especially as well, they had higher costs. So they are by far the higher cost producers, but then US and Ontario came at the next of the higher cost producers, and land was a significant factor in that piece as well as some of the direct input costs that we'd seen earlier or talked about earlier. But land cost was a factor in that. And again, that double cropping aspect comes into play when you look at the South American countries, because that land rent, that land cost is then able to be spread over the two crops. So that's one of the reasons that they're a little more competitive on a cost basis, because they're able to spread some of those fixed costs across more production than the Ontario and US examples.
Hey, a final question for you. Now, all this work is really done on, I guess, the farm gate costs, and as we talked about before we did this interview, that's only halfway. You got to get this to market. Any thoughts on how this sort of picture changes when you include the need for infrastructure and getting this crop to market?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big factor. Right now, we're just looking at what's your farm gate cost of production for these, and that's what this information was looking at. So yeah, the next big question is, how cost effectively can you get it to the export markets, and what kind of infrastructure do you have in place to be able to access those and take advantage of those export markets? And in Ontario and the US, we have the advantage of fairly good infrastructure. I mean, of course it has some challenges as well, but compared to some of the other countries, our infrastructure in terms of storage and railway systems to get to the ports and the access to port access for Ontario farms is better than some of the other countries. So we do have some advantages on that side of things, but from a competitive standpoint, those other countries aren't standing still either. We've got some fairly major announcements recently. Russia and Ukraine are looking at building more storage and buying more rail cars for grain trucking or grain transportation, and more infrastructure railway wise to get that grain more cost effectively to the ports. So from a competitive standpoint, they're not standing still. They're constantly looking at improving their infrastructure to improve that piece of it. And you certainly look at on the Argentinian side of things, or on the South American side of things, a lot of the inland transportation is all truck, so they're looking at improving some of that infrastructure as well to be able to reduce that cost from the farm gate to the ocean port.
Hey, John, great insights. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time and sharing your thoughts on Corn School.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks.